Well, hey, welcome to the To Be the Church podcast. I'm Tyler.
I'm Andrew.
Yeah, you are. Ben's still out, but
What happened to Ben, dude?
you know what? He does this thing called vacation. Maybe you heard of it?
Maybe.
Yeah, but
I've never taken any time off. I don't know
yeah.
what that's about.
So it's just Andrew and I. And hey, if you're watching on YouTube, you know this. And if you're not watching on YouTube, pause the podcast, wait till you get to a computer or a phone or a TV, and go watch us on YouTube, youtube.com/tobeTheChurch. The show is much more interesting when you can see our faces. I don't actually think that's true necessarily, but
It's relevant.
but we are on video. And so if you're watching on video, you know this. You know that we are currently not in our normal studio space. Our studio space is getting a bit of an upgrade, so we'll be back in there in a few weeks. But we're in our auditorium here at our East Vancouver campus at Northwest Gospel Church in Vancouver, Washington, Pacific Northwest, USA, North America, Earth. Yeah, it's kind of fun, a little different vibe here. And so if you're watching, you see this big banner behind me that says The Story. And this is the sermon series we're going through right now. And so we're going to get to some stuff, get to some questions, stuff like that. But first, what is the story?
What is the story, Ty? Creation, fall, redemption, consummation.
So the story of the Bible.
Yeah, indeed. The story, the grand redemptive narrative, as it's been called. And when I was out on sabbatical, thinking about this little gap of like 4 weeks we had between when I got back, the series that would be ending that first week, versus the new book study we'll get into the fall, Judges. I had 4 weeks that I had to fill something in. And so it, we could have just gone to the Psalms or something like that, but we already did that earlier in the year. And so I thought, dude, let's do a kind of a biblical theology overview series, and basically the elements of a Christian worldview, kind of what the story is. And so the hook is sort of like, as we look at the world around us, in a lot of ways we feel like we've lost the plot, if you will. And so here's the overarching plot to the story. Where do we come from? What's gone wrong? How can it be made right? And where is it headed? I guess you could say those would be 4 questions that sort of guide us into this Genesis 1, Genesis 3. I'm actually doing Joshua 20 for week 3 for redemption, which is going to be super different. And then ending with 1 Thessalonians 5 as the consummation piece. So, yeah, that's fun stuff.
Yeah, so in this first week, you kind of started with saying like, hey, you might be thinking, oh man, this is definitely just review or whatever. Yeah. Like a listener might be thinking of that. Why do you think, knowing that you're primarily speaking to Christians, knowing even just the makeup of our church, like why this, 4 weeks on these 4 elements?
Well, yeah, I think, and I say that in leading off the story series because I think people can think that right away. Oh, Genesis 1, I've heard this a bunch of times. I mean, I have preached through in the last 11 years, Genesis 1, I think it was probably my 4th time preaching that text, like just that text, since I've gotten here, and let alone the amount of times that we've referred back to that text and quoted it in other sermons. I mean, it's like man created in the image of God. It's a very, very foundational biblical thing. But I think like drilling down into it, spending time in it, and then contextualizing it for our current moment, is something that needs to be done often, right? And so same with Genesis 3, what I'm doing this week. And every time you preach a text like that, you're in a little different of a situation. Culturally, I look at our church right now, there's been a lot of growth in recent years and a lot of new people that haven't heard those texts preached. I think the last time I actually preached Genesis 1 and Genesis 3 was a sexual ethics series in 2018. So over 3 years ago. And even then, that was a sexual ethics series. So as I look back through those old notes, which I don't even really look at when I'm doing a new sermon until maybe the last day of prep to see if there was any exegesis that I might pull to the new one. But when I look back through those sermons, I would work through the text and then I'd go, okay, look at this through the filter of the subject of sexual ethics, right? What this tells us about sex specifically. And so this is not that. This is just like, let's preach this in its context as what it is, Genesis 1, Genesis 3, the foundation of basically the biblical worldview, right? So a little different angle on it. And, dude, I think a lot of Christians, because of all the noise and all the stuff we deal with, have not necessarily fully lost the plot, but it's like you're struggling to see how your worldview informs your thoughts, words, actions in the current cultural moment we're in. And I just think we're in such a difficult cultural moment right now that Christians need that equipping, right? So,
yeah, one of the things I got most excited about when you told us that you were going to do this series was I've read a few books on this framework, right? On like the story of Scripture. Sure, there's the story of Daniel and the story of Jesus and all these stories, but the story of Scripture as a whole are these four main themes that every other story fits inside to. It fits inside of. And when I started reading these books, and I think it was probably during like seminary class or something like that when I was reading a few of these books, but every sermon I heard started taking on new meaning. Every time I would go to, for instance, the story of Daniel, I'd be like, all right, where is this in that redemptive history, stuff like that. And then not only that, Mike Cosper wrote a great book called The Stories We Tell, which is this, I think the subtitle is like how every story longs to tell the ultimate story, or something like that, or how TV and movies long for the truth, or something like that. But in the intro of that book, Tim Keller says that like when he realized this framework, he said it also helped me make sense of everything, even the works of literature written and often passionately by often passionately anti-Christian authors. It helped me see that human beings may hold down the knowledge of God's reality. And from Romans 1, and so I started like watching TV differently, and I started seeing like, okay, here are the ways that, and in that book, Cosper talks about The Wire, and he talks about, I think, Pride and Prejudice, and all these different like movies and TV shows and stuff like that, that and how they either long for the story, right, or how they are like almost like the anti-story, even, like Breaking Bad is is like a case study on human depravity and the fall of man, and just like a spiral, if you will.
Yeah.
And so, I love this because like when this was illuminated for me, probably, I don't know, 5 years ago, and I probably heard it before, but it was like, oh man, at the front of my mind often. I listened to every sermon different. I read books differently. I watched TV shows differently, movies differently. And I think that can be a really beautiful thing. And what it did is it made a lot of the stories I was taking in, whether they be Breaking Bad or the story of Daniel in the Bible, an opportunity for worship, because you're looking at it in the whole grand narrative of Scripture.
Yeah.
But yeah, pretty cool. So this weekend upcoming is fall. And you said Genesis 3, so the initial fall. As you're studying this week, like what are the main ideas there?
Well, I just am changing my intro after what you just said. I'm like writing in new.
You're gonna be like, once
here.
I was watching Breaking Bad.
Yeah. So the idea is, it's temptation and sin, and then ultimately fallout. So like when I was first, and those aren't even the words I'm necessarily using, but when you first break down, I'm actually doing verses 1 through 10. Verse 10 is like a point you normally don't end at. When I've done this text in the past, I usually do the whole of chapter 3. But because, you got 3:15 is the first, gospel presentation of the promise of Christ coming, and you've got the scene at the end where they get kicked out of the garden, and then God, slaughters some animals and makes them animal skins, covers up their sin, which is also a big hook to the gospel. But temptation, sin, and the fallout, right? So that's basically what I'm going through. And so we'll spend some real time on the temptation that we were confronted with in verses 1 to 5, and then the delusion of sin, and then finally the alienation that occurred after we denied God. So, and then just sort of going into those things of temptation, sin, and alienation. It'll lead ultimately to God's pursuit of us. So verse 10, where we end, is like Adam and Eve say. Adam says, "We hid ourselves. I heard you walking, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself." So we kind of end in the middle of that before God lays out the whole curse thing, specifically to end on the note of the alienation and shame and fear that's a big part of the human experience now. And so, dude, I had this idea that I've never thought of before this week on this text. Native and foreign, okay? So like some things are native to us and some things are foreign to us. And the juxtaposition of that idea with the garden. So like when we were in paradise, things were native to us: blessing, perfection, purpose, provision, connection, and peace. And that everywhere in chapter 1 and 2, I have like chapter and verse for each one of those. The blessing of God in 128, purpose, chapter 2, verse 15, like he puts them in the garden to work it and to keep it. Provision, God provides them with food in the end of chapter 1, as well as the provision of the garden, the provision of one another, connection, the man and woman, right? The end of chapter 2, the perfect marriage covenant there, and then of course peace, and that's the end of chapter 2, verse 25, where like they were naked and there was no shame, and so you got blessing, perfection, provision, connection, peace. Those are native to us in the garden, in paradise, right, in Eden. And now east of Eden, which they get cast out to the east, and the whole book of Genesis is a really cool kind of directional note. I think I learned this from John Sailhammer's writings on Genesis, but it might have been him or somebody else. And his first name might be John. Anyway, so
I think it is, yeah.
Sailhammer. So that directionally east is like curse, and further east is like, you think of Babylon. That's like ultimately super far east, right, from the promised land type idea. And so they get cast out to the east, and then when Cain is cursed, he goes even further east, and so east of Eden, right, this idea of outside paradise lost, those things that were native to us are now foreign to us in our natural state. So instead of blessing, here's the new things that are native to us. In alienation, instead of blessing, it's curse, right? Instead of perfection, it's imperfection. Instead of purpose, it's futility. Instead of provision, now we have poverty is native to us now as human beings rather than provision. Instead of connection, we have division. Instead of peace, we have fear. So those things are now native to us, and those things that were native to us in the beginning are now foreign to us in our natural state away from God. And that's why it's like the Zach Eswine talks about the echoes of Eden, echoes of the fall. Like, just he encourages preachers to like continue to revisit in an apologetic sense, like the echoes of Eden. You might say the shadows of Eden. The things that are like still there that we long for that are gone now. And I think again, this text kind of shows us that these things that were meant to be native in us as created in the image of God, when we went to sever that link between us and God, we welcomed in all these things that are the exact opposite of what we were made to know and experience. And that's why we long for utopia, we long for paradise, we long for these things to be recaptured, and we try to recapture them in all sorts of different ways, but then temptation and sin move us in the wrong directions on that. So anyway, that was just an idea. I'd never had that idea before, and then I was running this week, and I thought, dude, native and foreign, like that might be a hook on either side of the text to kind of orient us to the moment we live in.
Yeah, it's interesting. And okay, so I've never thought of that before. Do you feel like Genesis 3 on, it just is instantly went from what's native changed? Or do you think that like the further the scriptural narrative goes into the fall, like the more native evil became? Like, what I'm saying? Like,
I think it's immediate. I think as soon as we were cast out of Eden, and the reason I think it's immediate is because it is. But then secondly, because
good reasoning.
I think let's look at the first of those 6, blessing to curse. Okay, so God blesses them. Chapter 1, verse 28. They're created in God's image. Male and female has made them, right? And then God blesses them and says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, blah, blah, blah. And then he gives them the provision of the food, and everything else. And then you get into chapter 2, which is sort of day 6 writ large, where you see the creation of man and the creation of woman and put in the garden to work it and keep it. And right as soon as we encounter God post-fall, so verse 8, verse 7, the eyes of both of them were open. They knew they were naked. They sewed their fig leaves. Verse 8, they hear the sound of the Lord walking in the midst of the garden. They hide themselves. Where are you? God calls out. They say, Adam says, we heard you coming and we hid ourselves because we were naked. Who told you were naked? And then he goes to the woman, and right away you see division. You see division between Adam and Eve, where there's blame shifting. There's like we learn in verse 6, right, when they eat of the fruit, that right away the eyes of both of them are open, and suddenly, like, they're no more naked in verse 7 than they were in verse 6, right? They're the same level of naked. And so you're like, they didn't get extra super naked. They just were, they're still naked, but the eyes of both of them are open. They knew that they were naked. So there's a break that happens, you might call it psychological, like they know something happens to their minds where, and I don't think they see, oh my gosh, I'm naked. What they see and what their eyes are open to is human life without God. Like, with a severed connection to God, we expose ourselves. Like, we've become exposed now to alienation, and we know shame, alienation, all those things at the beginning. So the division starts right away, and then blessing to curse. The whole rest of chapter 3 is God saying, like, this is the curse. Like I told you, when you eat of it, you will die, right? That's chapter 2, verse 15. Like, don't eat the knowledge of good and evil. When you eat of it, you will surely die. And Satan, the major lie, verse 4 of chapter 3, you won't surely die. Like, you're not going to die. God's not going to judge you. Like, no, God's envious, right? And so, and that's the whole thing on sin, all the stuff Satan does. But it's immediate, right? The curse is there, and then you see, before the end of that scene, God does give the provision of the animal skins, but then he moves them out from Eden. And so just like God said, it says that God consults with God in chapter 1, verse 26, let us make man in our own image. God turns to God at the end of chapter 3, and he says, God then again talks to God and says, we got to get them out of here lest they eat of the tree of life, right? And so then they get booted out, and right away, what do you see in chapter 4, dude? Talk about curse, murdering his brother. By the end of chapter 4, you got what's his name, Lamech. That's like, I'm going to take 2 wives, and I killed a young man for, like he talk about the depravity there. Like, he's the first guy who killed a human and then wrote a song about it, right? Like, he's bragging about it. Like he's bragging about his sin and depravity. So you see and then you see in the curse, you see, you're going to work your butt off, and thorns and thistles are going to come forth. Like, by the sweat of your brow, you're going to eat, and that's the futility, You just think of Ecclesiastes, like, all is vanity. Like, we work and then we die, and dang it, like that. That's basically the book of Ecclesiastes in 4 words, but 6 words, however many words that was. So I just think you see those things right away, right? And I think, like, I have this little kind of riff at the end of that. We severed a link, we corded a curse, we fractured fellowship, we cast away his cords of kindness, we ruptured the security of relationship, we fled from freedom, we discovered shame. And I don't know how I'll say all that, but like, those are the things that occurred when we chose to defy God, So, and then, yes, you see by Genesis chapter 6 that, like, mankind's gotten so bad that God wipes them off the face of the earth with the flood, right? But of course keeps a remnant, his grace. But it's pretty bad. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple things. First, I think we're going to title this episode, Andrew Says the Word Naked 47 times. That'll probably be what we name this one. But I didn't expect this or anticipate.
Why do we laugh at the word naked? I know why we do. We laugh at it because it's like
shameful.
Yeah. It's like, it makes us just giggle because we're 12, but also, anyway.
My youth pastor was from South Texas, and it was like not naked, it was naked. And so I'm hearing Stephen right now, naked. And like, I remember he preached one time on Genesis 3, and just like the whole youth group was just giggling the whole time. Not because of, partially because of the word, but partially because of the way he was saying it. But I didn't anticipate going this direction, but I was having a conversation with a friend recently about the problem of evil in the world. Yeah. And it came up, he was like, like, why does bad stuff exist? Because of the fall, or whatever. And he was saying, I see like a direct correlation to someone's like immediate consequences, right? Like, you smoke for 80 years, you get emphysema. You commit a crime and there are consequences to that. But we were talking, and he had, he was like, what about like cancer? He's like, I don't see a direct correlation between cancer and sin. Like, someone, and Jesus makes it clear too, like, who sinned, this man or his parents, like, why, and Jesus answers neither. But what is the correlation there? Like, and I didn't prep you for this question, we never prep for any of this, but, what are your thoughts on that? Because, you can easily look at some things and say, that is the consequence of this. Sin caused this pain. Yeah. But then you look at other things that just seem not fair, if you will, and, like, what does Scripture have to say about that.
On the connectivity of specific things, like you said, like cancer, as it relates to the fall.
Yeah.
Well, I think we see from Genesis 3 on, well, let's just say from Genesis 4 on, that things, it's a death sentence, right? So on the day that you eat of this, you will die. And I always think of Francis Schaeffer's book, Genesis in Space and Time, whenever I hear that phrase, the day that you eat of this, you'll surely die, because he brings out the fact that, like, it had nothing to do with, like, some magical fruit. Okay, this wasn't like, this isn't Snow White, that, like, bite the apple thing. It's that's not what the text is necessarily about. It was the act of rebellion. It was the act of defiance against God, and in that you become experientially familiar with sin, which then severs that link to God as fully holy and righteous, right? So Francis Schaeffer, I'm just paraphrasing here, but in that book, which is a phenomenal book, Genesis in Space and Time, it's Genesis 1 through 11. He writes, it's like a short book, but he says God could have just as well said, don't cross that river or climb that mountain or break that branch. Rather than don't eat that fruit, right? It's just the act of rebellion that did it. And so death, right? You will surely die. And so death, what does that mean? Spiritual death, physical death, like those become a part and parcel to our experience now. Those become native to us now, right? And so everything attendant with death also becomes native to us. So the beginning of all disease happens from there, and you can just read, and the Bible's not like a health handbook, that's like going to lay out the derivation of every disease, but you read throughout the story of God's people in the Old Testament and then into the New Testament, and we see disease everywhere. We see diseases in Egypt. We see diseases all throughout God's people, plagues, all sorts of things occur, and you see it everywhere in the text, even in places where you don't even realize it. Like Uzziah, the guy who was king when Isaiah the prophet was called, like he had a disease in his feet. If you read, like, I think it's in 2 Kings somewhere, and it's just like all these little things, like what did he have, like bunions? Like, I don't
Athlete's foot.
Athlete's foot. Like really bad athlete's foot.
He showered in the locker room,
Yeah. In bare feet, dude. Big mistake. So there's all these things. I think it's Uzziah that had the disease in his feet anyway. But there's just all these things that become attendant to its death. It's the things. God is life. God is, in connectivity with God is life. And we would look at it from our broken end and say that's where healing and life would be found in Him, wholeness, and the opposite of all those things are a result of the depravity that then breaks everything, not just our souls, spirits, whatever you want to say. It breaks our bodies and it puts us on a march toward death, and then it also toward physical death, and then it also it breaks our world. It shatters our world, and so the creation itself, Romans 8, is subject to futility. The creation itself is going through pains, until it itself receives redemption from God. So everything, so yeah, cancer, any of that kind of stuff. We can never go back through and necessarily, like I said, categorize every disease and find like where the biblical thread from it is. But our very cells, our very the makeups of our body are now subjected to futility and to death. So, and certainly there's a ton of ways that we ourselves do things to bring about new diseases. And I mean, like we invented cigarettes at some point, which lead to our broken cells, getting more broken and more beat up, and we call it cancer, or we call so there are certain things that are obviously the result, but like smoking a cigarette might feel really good, So there are all these kinds of things that are just attendant. I just keep coming to us, attendant to the human experience of somebody's wrote a book. I think it's Planiga. Not the way it's supposed
Cornelius?
to be. Either Cornelius or Alvin. There's two of them.
Cornelius, yeah.
but it's called Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, and it just is like I can't remember the subtitle, but it's like a monograph on sin, and it's a dark book, but a real book,
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, this may have brought up some questions. If that's the case, hit us up. podcast@toBeTheChurch.com is the way to do that. Also, if you're listening to this on the day it releases, Friday, August 20th, that sermon on Genesis 3 is coming in just a couple days. If you're a part of our church, we hope to see you here. If you're not a part of our church, you can always check out our sermons on our sermon podcast at nwagospel.com, or we have a podcast feed for that. Wherever you're listening to this, there's a podcast feed for that as well. And so we'll put links to that in the show notes. We'll also mention in the show notes all the books that we brought out in today's episode. Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, the Schaefer book, the Cosper book, stuff like that. And so those will be in the show notes. And again, if you're watching on YouTube, it'll be right there in the description. And until next time.
Dude, on that note, sorry, one more book, No Place for Truth by David Wells. Let's throw that one in there too. Oh my goodness.
I haven't heard that one.
I can't even start. Go.
All right, cool. We'll see you next time.